Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Brian.
And this is the Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things
related to the Christian faith.
That's right, Brian.
Yeah. Hey, you know, Ryan, we've had lots of really good interviews on our podcast in the past. I think about like the John Castelline's interview was fantastic.
Absolutely.
I think about Ryan Burge and Chad Ragsdale. We've had lots of really good interviews. We're really excited about the interview that we have for you today.
Absolutely.
This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, we've got Justin Brierly joining us today. And so you might have heard his name in the past. We've referenced, he's got a podcast and a book out called The Surprising Rebirth. What was it? The Surprising Rebirth?
A Belief in God.
A Belief in God.
Rebirth of Belief in God. And it's how new atheism grew old and something else is the subtitle. subtitle. But, while we don't know this very specific subtitle, we've listened to his podcast quite a bit, and it's been really fantastic. Yeah, we really highly recommend it. I think this will be a good way, if you're not familiar with it, to get introduced to some of the ideas in it. It's really, really enjoyable.
So we talked with Justin quite a bit about the book and kind of his main idea of the podcast. The book and the podcast mirror each other, but how he came up with this idea, and then what are some of the intricacies of this idea and where all this might be going.
Yeah. Justin's a longtime broadcaster, really a broadcast journalist from the UK. He's had other podcasts that he's done in the past. He's for a long time been dealing with this issue of Christians' conversations with atheists and agnostics. That's kind of a specialty. If you've seen the N.T. Wright, Ask N.T. Wright Anything, he was involved with that. There's been all kinds of other really interesting things that he's done, and just a wealth of interviews that he's done over the years with all kinds of really fascinating people. It was a really great interview. So I was going to say, Ryan, if you like this interview, do us a couple of favors. First of all, share it with somebody else. We're trying to get the word out about this podcast. If you haven't liked our show yet on your podcast, what do you call that? App. Go and do that. Review us if you feel so inclined. And there's also ways to support us as well. If you like this kind of interview and you want to see us continue to do this kind of thing,
let us know. Yeah, absolutely.
Ryan will tell you about it.
Yeah, so you can go to our website, thebiblebistro.com. There's a little button. We're on it today. There's a button in the top right corner where you can send us a message if you're liking that, or you can find us on Facebook at The Bible Bistro. Also on the Instagram, you can find us there at The Bible Bistro. So yeah, if you're enjoying this, find us there. You can support us. You can click the button to support us there on the website. But most importantly, as Brian has already shared with you, is that you can share some episodes, things that you found meaningful with others, and just kind of help us spread the word. So I think with all that, I think we've said everything that we need to say for right now, but let's jump right into this interview with Justin Brierly. We think you're really going to enjoy this.
Here it is. Well, we're pleased to have Justin Brierly with us, who is a journalist from the UK and has worked a lot in this area of thinking about faith. And Justin, I wanted to start with this question. It seems like if there's any center to your journalistic work, it's been trying to bring atheists and agnostics, I mean, you state this specifically, into dialogue with Christians. How did that become such a driving passion for your work, and why do you think it's an important thing that we do?
Well, I really began hosting these conversations between Christians and atheists way back in 2005. And it was when I began a radio show called Unbelievable in the UK on a Christian radio station. And I just had this idea for just hosting better conversations between Christians and non-Christians, because at the time I'd been working at the station a few years and we were very good at sort of talking to Christians about Christian things, and there's definitely a place for that. But most of the Christians I knew lived around non-Christians. You know, the UK is a very secular, quite post-Christian place. And so I thought, there'd be a value in actually modeling good conversations. And that was really where it began. And I guess my own interest was that I, had those kinds of questions myself. I went through a period of fairly significant doubt in my sort of university years, but I'd managed to find answers to some of those questions through apologetics, through thinkers like C.S. Lewis and so on. And I guess I wanted to, test Christianity in real life, seeing if it could stand up to scrutiny and having those kinds of conversations with people. So it was very much an experiment. And I never knew that it would lead to, 17 and a half years of hosting this show. And it would obviously go well beyond the shores of the UK as a podcast, a video show eventually, and everything else. But that was kind of where it began. And that was the passion that drove it. I wanted to kind of road test the ideas of Christianity outside of the bubble, if you like, and to kind of put it into kind of real life conversations, hopefully in that way.
That sounds great. One of the things we've been amazed by, and it's because of this work that you've done, is you have all of these interviews from the past to draw from. And so it's really interesting when you put together those documentary style episodes, you're able to kind of bring those older conversations in. So you have this book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And the central thesis is that we're seeing, at least maybe, in your mind, the first signs of a return to faith. What made you initially begin to think about that? Was there any kind of person you talked to or anything in the midst of that made you think, oh, there seems to be something going on here?
I think the catalyst for the book, to some extent, was a conversation I had with a UK thinker called Douglas Murray. And Douglas Murray is associate editor of The Spectator magazine. We're sort of contemporaries. We were both at Oxford together. He went on to much bigger and grander things than me. But he's an interesting person because he's quite a keen cultural thinker and commentator, quite a conservative sort of cultural critic. But whatever faith he had, he kind of lost by his early 20s. And he was very much sort of caught up, I think through his 20s with the new atheist movement. But I think he sort of came to reject that, or at least he came to see that it didn't have the answers that people were looking for. Because by the time I interviewed him about this, about 4 years ago now, he was starting to talk of himself as a Christian atheist. That was the label he used of himself. To the extent that he didn't believe in Christianity, but he did nevertheless recognize that all the values and virtues he did believe in kind of came from the Christian story. And he had kind of come to realize that actually the new atheist project, which sought to sort of tear down God and the value of religion, was sort of misplaced. And actually, he'd come to be convinced that actually he thinks we're much worse off without Christianity. Even as he struggles to believe it, he thinks the West is worse off without it. So I had this conversation. I had him in a conversation at the time with N.T. Wright, who's quite a well-known New Testament theologian and scholar. And they were kind of debating sort of where we go in the absence of the Christian story, meaning, morality, that sort of thing. And it was Douglas Murray who sort of referenced the well-worn line from Matthew Arnold's poem Dover Beach about the melancholy long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. And that has stood as an image for the last 150 years, really, of that sort of outgoing tide of faith and secularism and science and everything else sweeping into its place. But he said to me, the thing about the sea of faith, Justin, is it could come back in again. And he was saying this in the context of himself, as I say, talking about himself as a Christian atheist, but also seeing a number of his peers starting to take the Christian faith seriously again in terms of the value it brings to culture. But also, interestingly, some of them, he was telling me, jumping in and becoming Christians unexpectedly, quite surprising converts that he was coming across among his peer group. And I was seeing similar things. And this came at a period where, as I say, I'd been hosting these quite full-on debates between Christians and atheists, especially those new atheist type characters, typified by Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris and Dennett. But I'd also noticed a real change by that point. So I'm trying to remember when so this would have been actually around 2021, 2022, 2021 that we recorded that conversation. And definitely by that period, I had definitely noticed a change in the tone of the conversation. So it predated that, but he kind of catalyzed in my thought. There is a movement here. I've been seeing a change in the conversations I've been hosting, and that was sort of the point at which I thought, I think I need to write a book about this that specifically looks at the way that this conversation on God seems to be changing at the moment.
Interesting, yeah, and we've been told for years in our seminaries and in our discussions. Oh, look! You mentioned the idea of a secular nation. I lived in Scotland for a period of time, and we've always looked at Europe oh, look, that's what's happening, and that's where we're heading in the future. It's kind of the idea. So I find this fascinating. If there is this kind of return, what does that say for us as well? I think it's an interesting idea. You've hosted lots of conversations with people in this podcast. Then that's how we first became aware of you, through your podcast. That's the same name as your book, Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. I wonder if there's any of those. Of course, you've been interviewing people a long time. Are there any of those interviews that just stick with you and that you keep coming back to, or ones that stand out in your mind?
Well, you've definitely had a bit of a highlight reel by listening to the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, because in many ways, as you quite rightly surmise, that documentary series, which has only been going for the past year or so, very much does draw on a lot of those conversations, and in a way tries to sketch out the way those conversations did change over time as the characters changed and the new atheism sort of began to wane and so on. I mean, one of the ones that I feature quite prominently in the series, sort of about midway through the series, is, it's the story really of Tom Holland, the historian, and the way in which he has become quite an interesting cultural figure himself as a secular historian, reminding his audience about the way in which Christianity has completely shaped their world. But the debate that probably most typifies this, and which I used, at the outset of one of those episodes, was his debate with atheist philosopher A.C. Grayling. And again, this was somewhat unusual for my format, because normally the format was a Christian and a non-Christian to debate each other. But in this case, neither claimed to be a Christian, right. But they were debating an issue that they definitely kind of took very different positions on, which was whether we owe our morality to Christendom, to Christianity, basically, because this is very much has been Tom Holland's thesis in his best-selling book Dominion, that actually all of our values around human rights, equality, dignity, compassion, progress, they all stem from the Christian worldview that was inaugurated really by Jesus and the claims of his death and resurrection by his followers. A.C. Grayling very much comes from that new atheist school of thinking, and he very much writes and speaks to sort of try and put religion in its place. He thinks it's a a bit of a mind virus, actually, and when it comes to morality and that sort of thing, he thinks, well, it goes far beyond Christianity. That may have had some role to play, but it's you can go back to the Greeks and whoever to get the beginnings of all this. So they had the most wonderful debate on this, a really sparky back and forth, and it was just great fun just to be in the middle of this. Two brilliant minds, going back and forth on this, and to see Tom Holland sort of actually in a environment you don't often see him in, which is kind of really being pressed actually. And just responding magnificently as well, and it was just a really guilty pleasure at some points to see him take Grayling to the woodshed historically once or twice on his sort of account of Christian history and that sort of thing. But it was just it's just one of those standout debates where it was an absolute privilege to host and moderate that kind of an interaction, and definitely one of the ones that stands out.
Okay. Are there others that have that kind of that one really is kind of above and beyond? Yeah,
lots and lots of them that I've really enjoyed hosting over the years. I mean, another one that features quite prominently towards the beginning of the series is probably the one that is the most popular one I ever hosted, which was Jordan Peterson. And again, interestingly, an example of one where neither side is actually necessarily a Christian, but Jordan Peterson and Susan Blackmore. So Jordan Peterson, for those who don't know, is this sort of Canadian psychology professor. He really came to fame in 2018. He sort of started to become a very popular household name, or at least in certain circles, for just sort of filling auditoriums on lectures about meaning and purpose, and very much drawing on the Bible as an inspiration for that, and drawing huge audiences, and going on to draw huge audiences on podcast and YouTube and so on. But I happened to encounter his work just before he kind of really went stratospheric, as it were. Mm-hmm. And so I'd invited him on while he was planning to do a sort of small book tour of the UK, and I was in touch with his publicist. And people had been recommending this new guy on the block making some waves, Jordan Peterson. So I was like, okay, let's see what this guy has to say. We managed to kind of pencil some time in while he was in the UK with his publicist, because he had this book coming out called 12 Rules for Life. And as the date approached, the publicist got in touch with me saying, this guy's way more popular than I was anticipating. And can we just she was trying to sort of shave off a bit of my time because he was getting lots of other invitations. And they'd booked, a sort of lecture at a 1,000-seater auditorium, which had sold out in hours. And then they booked it again and it sold out again. Wow. And suddenly this publicist realized, this guy is actually something of a cult. He's got something of a cult following. And interestingly, I ended up bringing him on with the atheist psychologist Susan Blackmore from the UK. And they had a fantastic debate around whether we can make sense of life without God. Again, Jordan Peterson, not exactly in the chair as a Christian, but sort of playing the part of a Christian. So strongly did he defend the idea that we can't make sense of human value or dignity without some reference to being made in the image of God. So they had a fantastic conversation. Again, if you read Peterson's book, lots of biblical references, lots of sort of stuff that, you might find coming out of any Christian apologist's mouth. And so they had a really good conversation. The interesting thing about that was that, I don't know if this is something you guys recall, but in my world, Peterson really went stratospheric after he did an interview with someone in the UK called Kathy Newman, a Channel 4 news anchor.
Yeah, it got shared quite a bit.
Yeah,
here as well.
It kind of went viral. Yeah. It was this kind of debate on the gender pay gap, and just kind of Peterson's fairly cool dismantling of her arguments kind of it just kind of sent it kind of viral, Well, funnily enough, that interview happened just a couple of days after I recorded my discussion with him. But I was sitting on this material because we weren't planning to release it for a few months. So just after I'd recorded it, suddenly everyone started talking about Jordan Peterson, and he was everywhere, and everyone was, sharing this clip of him. And so I couldn't, we had this schedule, so I couldn't put our interview out. But I knew that I was suddenly sitting on this really hot property, and I'd kind of managed to bag him just before it would have been probably far harder to get hold of him. And so when it did finally release, it kind of just launched our YouTube channel, really, because so many people were interested in that. But it was a very substantive conversation as well, and it was a good one, and that kind of. And the reason that one comes to mind is because he's a really good example of the way this conversation has changed. It really has changed from the heyday of the new atheism.
It reminds me of a conversation we've been having that Justin has mentioned, both Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson. Do you want to ask that question we were talking about earlier?
It's the idea of how these two men who are not theists, that it's kind of that God's using them maybe in some way, that there seems to be people coming to faith through some of their work. Like, how do you interpret that? How do you interpret what's going on with these two guys that haven't taken that full leap yet into faith of God? Like, how do you interpret that? How do you understand? What do you think about that?
I do think that God uses all kinds of means and methods to bring people to himself. And very often it is through people who aren't necessarily signed up themselves. And I've been sort of likening them and others to sort of prophets from outside the church who are acting as a gateway to Christianity, even as they're not completely, sure of it themselves in a funny way. I mean, Tom Holland, to give him his due, sort of is constantly teetering on the edge. And he's, I had a very candid conversation with him, a public conversation a few months ago in London, in front of an audience, where he talked about how, some personal experiences have kind of brought him to the edge of belief. So I'd say with Tom, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here, he would say, look, there are some days when I really struggle to believe it. And there are other days when actually, I feel like I really do believe it. And to some extent, that kind of reflects the way sometimes many Christians feel, faith comes and goes, doubts assail us. But I suspect, to be honest, Tom, has found actually he goes to church. He is, a communicant Anglican in that sense. He's, probably found his, where he feels comfortable at this point. But I think he probably himself would say, actually, when it comes to pointing people towards Christianity, I'm probably more use kind of where I am than sort of seen as an insider, if you like. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think people somehow, funnily enough, are more willing to listen to people if they don't feel they're already inside. And so, yeah, I would say, in God's, divine economy, that there is something there about the fact that he will often use people who are not insiders to help people who do want to move inside.
Yeah.
It's a great story you share about his prayer and the subsequent events that happened there. I won't spoil it. I thought about Jordan Peterson's wife as well in your conversation with her, and her talking very, very clearly about that.
Yeah. You mentioned the conversation has changed from the new atheism time. The conversation has changed. You're an apologist. The conversation has probably changed. One of the things that's kind of struck me, and Brian kind of alluded to this, is like it seems to be the role of, yes, there's reason, but there seems to be these experiences that are driving some of these stories. Like they're having, Tom Holland has had some of these experiences. One of your interviews was talking about, I got to the back of the wardrobe and I just felt their fur coats back there. Like there's looking for this experience. So how do you see this role of reason and experience kind of taking, at least for me and my perspective, taking on the experience of the divine, having more conversation, or being a conversation partner now that it wasn't in the new atheist timeline?
I think that's right. I think to some extent, the new atheism came at a time when we'd been moving in a very, for a long time, a materialist direction, a sort of scientific direction in culture. And they kind of just cemented that and kind of tried to drive this narrative that, the spiritual does not exist, essentially, and that everything can ultimately be explained by chemistry and physics. And that is the disenchanted age we live in. That is the kind of the background sort of hum, really, of most people's lives is they've been told this kind of materialist story of reality. I do sense that's changing, though, to the degree that I think it's impossible to completely disenchant people, because it's very hard to deny our kind of immediate sort of sense that we are spiritual beings, and it comes out in all kinds of other ways. So even the new atheists, I think, have been surprised to find that even as much as they seemed to be quite successful in pushing this narrative, nonetheless, when you look around our culture, people suddenly get religious about all kinds of other things, whether it be a political cause or a sort of ideologies around sex and gender or whatever. So there's the sort of spirituality sort of pops up in all kinds of other manifestations, and it turns out, and it's a bit like playing whack-a-mole. You think you've defeated Christianity, but it comes up over here in a different form, these kind of quasi-religious forms. And so they've had, I think, a really difficult time, actually, and realizing that we're all kind of more intrinsically religious than they realized. And to that extent, I think the new atheists themselves have sort of slightly given up on the project of trying to talk people out of religion. They've kind of almost accepted, well, we're going to have it, like it or not. People are kind of intrinsically religious. It's just pick your poison. Do we prefer this type of religion over that type of religion? And a lot of new atheists that I'm bumping into, interestingly now, are kind of saying, I wish we hadn't spent so much time trying to, disprove Christianity, because actually the kind of quasi-religious stuff going on in our own academic backyard now is far more insidious and dangerous to us than what the fundamentalists down the road believe. And I think actually, in an ironic way, they find more common cause very often now with many Christians than they used to, because they might have similar concerns over, I don't know, transgender or whatever it might be. And so I think this has also, though, opened up, because as I say, this conversation has changed, that materialist sort of thing doesn't dominate conversation so much in the popular culture. It's kind of giving room for people to take the transcendental and the spiritual more seriously again. And you are able to have conversations about religious experience, for instance, that you might have been laughed out of the room about at one time. It's why I think Tom Holland can stand up on the stage, and talk about this strange answer to prayer that he experienced and not get sort of laughed at by his peers in the way that he might have done 10 or 15 years ago, because it feels like I don't know, we've been given permission to sort of start to take those things seriously again and start to understand that actually this is just actually the normal experience of most people. Weird things happen, things that are very difficult to quantify purely in terms of science and reason. And yeah, I'm kind of, I welcome that. The problem is it can go off in all kinds of strange directions. Obviously,
Right.
there's all sorts of,
I was going to mention Charles Taylor. His, that's basically his thesis. We got to this point of secularity, but then we have this explosion. He calls the nova, right? The nova effect of all of these different types of belief, different kinds of spiritualities, multiple spiritualities. So it's interesting that there is this return to this, as you keep calling it, the story of Christianity, which I want to talk about later. Ryan, did you have another follow-up? I didn't want to.
So no, you're good. So towards the end of the first season, you dedicated an episode to helping the church prepare for this potential return to faith. What are some things that you would want the North American congregations to know about this returning tide? Is what you kind of called it, this tide that's coming back in? Like what are some things that how we should prepare ourselves, and maybe things that we should be afraid of doing as well? Like what should we stay away from?
Yeah, no, great questions. Well, maybe there's specifically three things that I talk about in the final episode and in the final chapter of my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, which kind of come out of these conversations I've been having with some of these interesting intellectuals who are interested again in Christianity and taking it seriously. And we could just take each in turn, but the first is this idea of keeping Christianity weird, and that's a kind of interesting point that's been brought up by a number of people, including Tom Holland, including Douglas Murray, who have said, look, if you want to attract the kind of meaning seekers back, Justin, don't sort of dumb down Christianity. We want the people who are actually embracing Christianity are kind of embracing the full-fat, full-blooded version of it, actually. And they're looking for something different to their everyday life and story. And so one manifestation of this is, for instance, that when he does go to church, Tom Holland goes to London's oldest church, St. Bartholomew the Great, over 900 years old, and more or less still looks like it did, 900 years ago. And I think that's because it ties him back to the kind of historical roots of Christianity, but it's also the very traditional Anglo-Catholic worship and ritual that takes place there. It sort of lifts him into a different world. It is mysterious. It is otherworldly. It is a bit hard. It's something that transcends a purely intellectual approach, and he is looking for that. He's looking for kind of mystery and weirdness, because one of the things he's often railed against is what he sees as a sort of politically correct, good advice version of Christianity that often seems to prevail in Britain, which he just finds pointless, because it's sort of, well, we can get good humanistic advice, from all kinds of quarters now. And given the church, the other point he makes is, given that Christianity has been so successful that many of the things the church used to do in terms of healthcare, education, poverty relief and so on are now done by the state, because the state got so Christianized that it basically took on those things that the church used to be the prime provider for. He said the church has to kind of, if it wants to look distinctive, it needs to kind of put its energy into its strangest claims. It's the claims that continue to look weird in our contemporary culture, and that is its claims about the miraculous. And this idea that, a virgin birth and a resurrection and angels and heaven and hell and everything else. And he says, don't duck that. Don't be embarrassed about it, because actually that's the thing that will actually draw people who are looking for that sense. And again, I've heard similar kind of sentiments, again, from Douglas Murray, who's concerned about what he sees as the church sort of going in very sort of politically correct direction to try and sort of embrace the culture. But he says all it ends up doing is makes the church just seem like yet another sort of shallow facet of a kind of, the culture that already exists. So I think that's
we don't do it as well as the culture.
Well, yeah, exactly. That's the other problem sometimes. Yeah. So that was one interesting sort of, takeaway. Keep Christianity weird. Now, that's going to look different for different churches. I don't think every church needs to adopt smells and bells and incense to do that. But there is something about not kind of being comfortable in our own skin when it comes to the supernatural claims of Christianity, expecting to some extent the supernatural, sort of not trying to hide the weirdness, of Christianity. It's countercultural claims when it comes to, sexual ethics, to sort of the way we interact and the way we do things. It's a sort of, it's that's one particular area where I think there's an interesting challenge to many churches who maybe have tried to blend in to the culture in order to be more appealing. But that may actually be the opposite of what actually happens when you do that.
Yeah, Andrew Root, we've interviewed. I don't know if you're familiar with his name or not, but he's written quite a bit about what it's like to have faith in a secular society, and he has some interesting things. And I'm just thinking about this. You said not necessarily those bells and smells and the charismatic, for example, but his is really about helping one another see the way that God is at work in our lives, and through a term that you use quite a bit, story. He says it's just a matter of talking about how we see God at work in our lives and sharing those kind of stories, and not being afraid to see the way that he's working. Yeah. I'm going to skip ahead to a question I was going to ask later, but the last episode of your first season, you talk about story in particular. Especially the very last bit, you kind of summarize the entire thing. Why do you think story is such? Why do you think that's a category that's important for us to use, and how do you think it's an important part of what we're doing is talking about Christianity? Yeah,
well, it's another one of those areas that I encourage the church to consider taking up as it tries to meet this wave of meaning seekers, is that I think we are essentially story-driven creatures. As I was saying earlier, the new atheists, I think, assumed that once we got rid of religion, we'd just enter into this utopian future based on science and reason. Right. What they didn't anticipate was that because we're story-driven creatures, we will just substitute other stories for the Christian story. And they may have their own kind of quasi-supernatural aspects to them, as I was saying. And I think that's something to do with the fact, that we're meant to live in a story. We're meant to understand ourselves as having some kind of a beginning, middle, end, a sort of Genesis to kind of Revelation kind of way in which we understand our lives. And, even the secular psychologists will tell you that people who don't think of themselves in that way really suffer. It's living as though life is essentially chaotic and isn't bounded by any kind of sense of a narrative, I think is very unhealthy actually for people. So just at that level, we tend to imagine ourselves in a kind of storytelling way. But of course, I believe that the reason that's there deep in our sort of soul and our psyche is because we are made in the image of God, and we're meant to see ourselves as part of this bigger story. The problem is, going back to Charles Taylor, who you referenced earlier, because we have become this culture of expressive individualism where we all have our own story and we each have our own sort of ends and our own sort of personal journey, if you like. These are the kind of buzzwords, aren't they? The problem is that tends to move you in the direction of what we now say are the culture wars, because if everyone's stories are essentially their own and they can invent themselves from scratch, then you end up obviously with lots of competing stories of reality and competing stories of what's good for people and what's not. And as we've lost that sort of Christian story, which essentially kind of gave a unifying story to generations of people across quite diverse cultures, we've replaced them with these lots of individualistic stories. It's generating this confusion and polarization and conflict that we now experience in our culture, and that's partly why I think we're running out of steam on these stories, because they're not satisfying us. They're not the stories that we're meant to live our life by. They end up just draining us. They become, essentially idols, to use another metaphor, that we put in the place of God, but which can't do God's job. And that's why I think we're starting to see an openness again to the Christian story, because people like Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson and others are sort of reminding secular folk, well, there was this story that once made sense of our lives, and it turns out it was pretty good, actually. It turns out that whatever you may think about whether it's true or not, it did actually have all these extraordinary fruits that we still appreciate in Western culture. And as people see those fruits start to wither, as we start to see kind of, the culture wars and conflict and everything else, I think people are starting to realize maybe it's because of the stories we're telling ourselves that they're not doing the job anymore. And as it were, when you lose the roots, the original story, the fruits themselves will eventually die. And so I just wonder whether we're coming to one of those points where more and more people are starting to realize this, more and more of these intellectuals are pointing it out in various different ways. And it's starting to make people realize we do need a story to live by. And the stories we're telling ourselves are not doing the job. Maybe we need to reinvestigate the original story that so much of our culture was originally based on.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. As I don't know if this is a trend or not. It's just one thing that I've kind of observed. It seems like when someone is looking for that meta narrative that ties life together, it seems like Christianity seems to be the last stop on their journey. Like it seems like, oh, I have this meta narrative. I know there's maybe one out there, but I'm going to try every other narrative that might exist before they come back. I mean, is that a trend that you feel like you're hearing in conversations, like Christian, and why? Maybe why do you, if it is, why do you think that might be?
Yeah. I definitely find that is the experience of many people of an older generation, slightly older generation, and I think it's because they've sort of been inoculated against Christianity because they think they know it, because they maybe had some semblance of Christian education at school. So the person I'm thinking of is Paul Kingsnorth, who I featured on the podcast and in the book as well, who is definitely one of these surprising converts because he says very explicitly he was not expecting to become a Christian. That was kind of the last story that he thought he would ever find would make sense of his life and so on, because he essentially thought he knew what Christianity was because he, was raised in a sort of nominally Christian environment at school. He kind of had the traditional British upbringing, which does involve, school hymns and sort of Bible stories and maybe the vicar coming in, once a week to talk to the kids. And he'd rejected it because it seemed irrelevant to his life. He wasn't interested. And he kind of, was essentially a teenage atheist, but he then went on this rather extraordinary journey through kind of realizing actually he loved nature. He was really connected with nature. He spent a lot of time in the woods and in the mountains with his father. And he ended up actually kind of turning to Buddhism for many years because he found he needed to find something, that he needed some source of transcendence. And so he kind of looked within to kind of try and find that. But even that didn't satisfy. He told me that he eventually decided he needed to worship something. So he thought, well, I love nature. I could try worshipping nature. And so he literally became a Wiccan, for some time. And that was, an interesting period because he had a sort of period of his time where he found that it was interesting, but in the end he describes it as sort of a pastiche of esoteric worldviews and Christian heresies. Right. And the thing that he finally came to, and as I say, the last thing he was expecting was the Christian story. And that was sort of really through all kinds of interesting encounters with people who he had been following, who it turned out were Christians, through his wife just randomly blurting out over dinner one evening, I think you're going to become a Christian. And yeah, and she wasn't a Christian herself, but he said, he just said, don't be ridiculous, but she was right. And also interestingly, in his case, having dreams about Jesus. Yeah. And he says, he's sort of a bit like Lewis, the most reluctant convert. He got kind of dragged kicking and screaming out of his Buddhist and Wiccan sort of past. And, but it was, and he says, he said, at the time he converted, which was only a few years ago, he said, if you'd shown me myself now a few years ago, I would have laughed at you. But there's something about, these folk who I think, because there's a sort of cultural Christianity that already exists there, they think they know it. And so it is the last thing they think would actually be the answer. But when they come back to it, when they actually encounter it sort of again, sort of as adults, and actually getting to grips with the real story, they suddenly see, oh, what I rejected as a youth wasn't actually the Christian story. It was this sort of, so that's happening for those folk. Now, I think it's a bit different, actually, for folk who don't even have that Christian experience, that sort of cultural memory of Christianity. And that's more where Gen Z, for instance, find themselves. They don't even have, they didn't grow up going to church occasionally. They didn't have, the Sunday school hymns or whatever. So they're kind of coming from a completely unchurched background. And interestingly, I think there's less resistance in a funny way to Christianity for some of that cohort. There's still kind of significant barriers potentially around, prevailing attitudes around sex and everything else. But there's a kind of, I've often found that there are actually fewer barriers. They're kind of willing to give it a listen because they don't have preconceived notions that need to be jettisoned, that need to be, and there's less kind of religious baggage in a funny way with many of those who just haven't experienced Christianity. So it does depend a little bit on the generation in question.
Yes. So as an apologist, how do we, because the conversation has changed, there's always going to be that kind of apologist of the past, where we need like the facts and all that stuff. But kind of as we encounter this you've had these conversations, you've had a lot of conversations with people in different spectrums. How as a Christian, the church needs to keep itself weird, but how as an individual, how do we have these conversations to in that kind of context, to have an effective conversation as an apologist when the conversation has changed that way?
I think it is to some extent about recognizing that the questions have changed a bit. So you're not likely to be encountering the sort of immediately the same objections that you were during the New Atheist era. That in that era, it was all about these sort of high octane debates between Christian thinkers and atheist objectors who were talking about, give me philosophical, scientific evidence for God. Here's my case against the Bible and why it's evil. Here's, so these were the sorts of ways in which the conversations were being had. I think that's less the case today, and you tend to be starting more from a point with most people where they're asking sort of more existential questions around how do I get some sense of purpose or meaning in life? Why do I feel so depressed? What's the is there a better way? The channels, the YouTube channels and the podcasts and so on that are really popular these days are these kind of self-help ones where it's all about improving your life through meditation or through sort of engaging maybe with some kind of stoic philosophy, or there's lots of these sort of wellness kind of gurus, and even some of the former New Atheists like Sam Harris, they're now essentially turned into one of these sort of meditation and wellness gurus, because that's where people are. They're not kind of really starting from a point of wanting to debate God, but I think we still want to bring them to the point where they obviously make them aware of their need for God. But you're going to be probably starting from these much more sort of existential questions about people's meaning and purpose and what gets them out of bed in the morning. And that will, I think, mean also changing from a more, rather than starting with apologetics, starting with here's my philosophical evidence for God, here's my 4 reasons for the resurrection. I think you have to start in a more imaginative mode. You have to start by engaging people with kind of the way they want the world to be and the way they're encountering the world. And again, you kind of referenced the sort of the final episode of the last season where I really sketch out the way C.S. Lewis did this, I think, in a wonderful way. He was a brilliant apologist, obviously. He wrote those books like The Problem of Pain and Mere Christianity, giving a logical defense for Christianity. But he captured the most people, I think, for Christianity through the Narnia stories and that imaginative approach of creating a fantasy world with a, true but not tame, wonderful lion who, we all aspired to meet, and just imbued that world with so much meaning that it led to lots of people wishing that it were true. And in the process, Lewis was able to hold that out as an example and say, well, what if this is true in your world? And I think there's something about that approach, that appealing to people's imagination about the way they would want the world to be. And then to say, well, what if the world really is this way? What if there is a story that is true, that there's a true version of this story? Jesus really did, come once among all the other myths and stories that have been told. This was the true one. And that's going to look different for each person that we meet. But there's somehow starting there before moving to that more kind of, showing them that it's true with the nuts and bolts of what Christianity is. Start there with the imagination, I think.
This is kind of going a little bit against what you've just said in a way, but I wanted to ask you, your earlier book's unbelievable. And the subtitle is why, after 10 years of talking to atheists, why I'm still a Christian. I recently had a friend ask me, actually, she said, well, I want you to do a podcast episode on why you are a Christian. What is it about it? And I gave her some of the reasons right away, and it may be something we do down the road. But I thought, having you on, I wanted to ask you this question. If that question were posed to you, why do you believe? How would you at least briefly respond to that question yourself?
Well, that's very much what that book was written for. And I do that work of kind of more traditional apologetics there. But I hope that I do it in a way that does engage also with the more kind of imaginative elements of people, because the way I would answer this is looking at what it means to be human to some extent. And there's three particular ways in which I find that it makes a lot of sense to believe in God. Because in the end, it's my view that we all believe in something. Lots of my friends, that I've had are atheists or functionally atheist. And that means that they essentially, have a worldview, which is ultimately everything can be described in the end by the laws of physics and chemistry, really. And I have a view as a Christian that actually there's a mind behind the universe and behind existence, and that we're meant to be here, that there's a sort of a purpose, if you like, to life. And the question is, whose worldview fits better? Okay, if we were just to kind of look at those two. And that's what I essentially do in that book, is primarily contrast atheism and Christianity. And there are three key areas where I'd say, when it comes to these three areas, God is a better explanation of reality. So human existence, I think that the fact we're here, there are all kinds of ways in which that points back to a designer, someone behind the scenes, if you like, that it's far less likely that we're here by purely a product of chance, time and chemistry. When you look at some of the interesting phenomena that have been discovered about what it took for us to be here, Big Bang cosmology, the fine-tuning of the universe, the extraordinary complexity of life developing in the first place, the fact we can do science at all, and the fact that the universe is written in the language of mathematics, it all seems to fit better with the biblical account that we were made, that there is a God behind it, than with a purely naturalistic explanation. So human existence, but then if you don't look out, rather than looking outside ourselves, look inside ourselves to human value, where does that come from? And again, I think Christianity gives a better account of how we make sense of this idea most of us have about the idea that, we should believe in the inherent dignity and value of human beings, that there are some better and worse ways to treat human beings. I've never met a satisfactory naturalistic account of that impulse to give human beings value and dignity. But it's right there on page 1 of the Bible. If we're made in the image of God,
right.
Then it makes perfect sense of that kind of that impulse. And then human purpose. So having talked about existence value, human purpose, again, the fact that there is this search for meaning and purpose across all times, places and cultures. Again, on an atheistic account of reality, that is just a blind alley that we've been tricked by, the happenstance of evolution to going down. There is no answer. There is no ultimate purpose. The universe will one day, all meaningful thoughts and existence will evaporate in the heat death of the universe in a couple of trillion years' time. There's no story, essentially. So this does come back to the story thing on an atheistic view. But if we can't shake that nagging sense that actually there is more to life, that there is some kind of meaning that we're here for, that there are ways of living life that are meant to be, then that fits again with the idea that of a God who has created us for a purpose and to live within a certain story of reality. And by and large, that has worked out well for people who have adopted that. So in these three ways, I make the case that it makes more sense to believe in God on balance. And that is a kind of classic apologetics-y kind of way of doing things. But I hope along the way to appeal to the fact that we're more than just brains or legs, that actually there's something deep down inside us that wants this to be true, that doesn't want the world to be the way Richard Dawkins describes it, of just blind, pitiless indifference, that there's something that most people have experiences in their lives that seem to scream out against that idea. So, yeah.
It's interesting to me, you start with the individual, whereas the other stories tend to start with the universe, the big, the cosmic, and you're saying, let's start with meaning and purpose and value. That's really interesting. Yeah.
I got a question. I know we're short on time. We're getting wrapped. I got one question for you. You've had conversations over the years, and particularly some of those you've maintained these ongoing conversations, and there seems to be some genuine care between you and respect from those you've interviewed. So what is your encouragement like on some tips to maintain similar ongoing conversations with the same tone with people that you fundamentally disagree with? You know what I mean? Like that, what tips would you have for those that we have disagreements with, inside the church and outside the church, in all these different facets of life, to have these fruitful, ongoing, respectful conversations?
Well, the first thing I'd say is probably get off social media if that's where you spend most of your time, because it's terrible, not just for what is on there, but the way it actually does shape us in all kinds of ways. And that's true actually of a lot of our media generally. It's predicated on polarizing, combative exchanges, and it tends to amplify the loudest voices at each end of the spectrum. And sadly, that's just the way it works from an advertising perspective. That's where they make their most money, and that's what they tend to reinforce. But it can really, unfortunately, I think, make it really difficult to have good conversations in our culture, because we're so trained by this kind of very polarized sort of way in which the conversations tend to happen online and in the media space. So I think it's really important just to try to get around the table with people, to have face-to-face conversations, to kind of rehumanize people, see that they're more than just an idea that you disagree with to be demolished, that they're someone made in the image of God, someone that God loves just as much as he loves you. And that alone, hopefully, can make a difference, just doing that. And I was trying to do that, as I say, with the Unbelievable show for all those years. We tried to do the face-to-face thing as much as possible, because it does make a big difference. It's much harder to be rude to someone that you're literally sitting down in front of than it is to do it online. If you do it online, it's really easy to be rude to people, and I've been guilty of that myself. So I think that's really important. I think though, especially in the kind of polarized times we live in, where we do tend to demonize. We're encouraged to demonize others. It involves a conscious decision not to play by those rules, and to embody the grace, that we are commanded to have as Christians. When 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you about the reason for the hope that you have. It has that really important, bit at the end, but do this with gentleness and respect. And, that's the most important bit, arguably, of that whole verse is the gentleness and respect, because the reasons for the hope you have won't land if I think they're not delivered with gentleness and respect. Even if you get it thrown back in your face, I think the Christian, the Christian imperative is not to, answer evil with evil. And so I think we just have to be really see this as a spiritual discipline, that actually we're meant to hold to a different standard. We're meant to have conversations that are different. And my encouragement for anyone who's kind of in that situation is just to try to be faithful in being there for people when you do have those conversations, even if they don't seem to be going anywhere. If you feel like you're hitting your head against a brick wall with someone, just show up as often as you can. Be willing to continue the conversation. Don't close it down. And you never know when something might happen. That person might have an experience. Something might happen to suddenly make them actually try to engage in the conversation in a different way. And that's been my experience. Sometimes it's been years and years of feeling like, oh, this person's never going to change their mind. And then suddenly there is something and if you're there, if you're still in the conversation, then that could make all the difference for that person, I'd say.
Thank you, Justin. It's very helpful. And thank you so much for your time. We've been very, your podcast has been very helpful to us. Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. We've recommended it on our podcast. We've recommended it individually to many people.
Thank you.
We were very pleased the second season is going to be coming out. We're looking forward to that. I want to give you a chance. Is there anything else that you have in the works that you want to talk about?
Oh, well, we're also working on releasing some videos, some longer videos from the podcast series. So what you hear on the podcast series is more kind of these documentary, lots of talking heads, with my narration, weaving it together. But if you want to kind of start to check out some of the more long form interviews that made up a lot of those shows, we're going to be releasing a number of those on our YouTube channel in coming months. So do feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Justin Brierly is what you're looking for. But yeah, all I can encourage people is go and get subscribed and recommend it. That I love hearing that you guys have been recommending it, because that's the best news that I could have. It's just I've been stunned actually at how quickly the podcast has been taken up by a lot of people, and I think it is on the basis of primarily just word of mouth. So thank you for that. And if people again want a different kind of way of diving into it, there is the book. And we even send out signed copies of the book from my website. So if people want more, just go to the website, justinbrierly.com. You can find the book there, signed copies, the podcast series itself, links to the YouTube channel, and of course, the newsletter and everything else. So, yeah.
I'll commend it's very, very much worthy of support. So I would encourage any of our listeners who want to do that to do that and go and check those things out. Yeah. Well, thank you again, Justin. It's been a pleasure to speak to you, and just look forward to what you'll bring in the future to the conversation. Very important conversation, I think.
Oh, well, bless you guys, and thank you for what you're doing with your own podcast. And yeah, really, really encouraged that you wanted to reach out, because you're enjoying the podcast. That makes my day. And yeah, really great to talk to you today as well.
Thank you. God bless you too.
Yeah. Take care. Bye-bye. So as we're wrapping up here, I just want to say thank you for joining us with this. I know it was a fun conversation. You enjoyed it, Brian, as well?
I did. It was really good. Yeah, I'll make sure to share it again with others that you think would find this useful.
Yeah, and we will see you all next Tuesday as we continue in
Zechariah.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much, Brian. Thanks so much, Justin. We'll see you all next Tuesday. Bye-bye.